Hello and welcome to another episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me as ever is Jessica Meyer, Chris Kempshall, and joining us is Sofya Anisimova. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at how the First World War has been represented and portrayed in Russia. Sofya, thanks for joining us. And you set us homework. Thank you for doing that. So we've all watched, almost all of us watched, we watched the 1931 Russian film Sniper, of which, amazingly, there is no English subtitles, though there's not a lot of spoken word anyway. Let's start by talking about you. Your primary research interest is Russia's military strategy and the Entente in the First World War. But you have a side project of researching aspects of memory and social history around the war in Russia. So do you want to tell us about that and how about those two themes might interact?
Yes, my PhD, I'm a PhD student at the University of St. Andrews, and I'm working on a dissertation that looks into military strategy and sort of like place of Russia within the Entente. But I was always interested in the cultural and social aspects of the war, and my interest in the First World War was actually started with the research into Russian Expeditionary Force. So a number of Russian soldiers that were sent to France to fight with the French forces, and I sort of looked into the story and the social aspects of the experience in France, and in particular the aspect of the commemoration of the Russian Expeditionary Force and what happened to the veterans in the Soviet Union. And actually, I think we'll get a chance to talk about it today as well, because the image of the Russian Expeditionary Force in Russia today is one of the most prominent images of the war that exists and are present in the Russian public memory. And it's one of the reasons why I actually stumbled across it, because it was in the newspaper, and I kept the clipping from the newspaper about where I first read about the Russian Expeditionary Force, and then it sort of like sparkled my interest, and I kept going and worked on it, and then eventually published something about it, and then hopefully the veterans piece will come out soon as well.
So if we're going to be looking at the memory of the war, shall we start with that, with Sniper, which is the Russian Expeditionary Force it's looking at, isn't it? Do you want to give us a synopsis of the film? Because it's a bit, well, slightly different from what I expected.
Yes, so that's a 1931 film that tells the story of a Russian soldier of Russian Expeditionary Force, who was sent to France and to be trained as a sniper. And so that's his story, and his story of him coming back to the Soviet Russia after the war. And obviously, because it's 1930s, the film is sort of like presents the Soviet ideology at the time and the Soviet understanding of the war at the time. And for the Bolsheviks, the war was the imperialist war. So the soldiers who represent the working class were sent to die for the capitalist interests. And that's what the film kind of tries to portray, because the soldier, there are two characters in the film, and one protagonist, one antagonist. And protagonist is a Russian soldier who is he used to be a worker at St. Petersburg factory. And the antagonist is the Russian officer. So not an enemy, but a Russian officer who accompanies him to France, and he's also a sniper. They fight together against the Germans in France during the war, but then they after the war ended, the Russian soldier returned to Soviet Russia and became worker again, whilst the Russian officer, he joined the white Russian forces and fought against the Bolsheviks. And so the film ends with a scene of Russian soldier killing the said officer, who already turned to be an enemy of Russia. So that's an interesting how kind of the film sets up the story of the war, not as a story of the Entente or Russia versus Germany, but as the story of the workers versus the privileged classes. In this case, officer represents the privileged class. And the thing is, like, the story of the Russian Expeditionary Force was very often used at that time by the Soviet government, because not just one film was made about Russian Expeditionary Force, but two. Unfortunately, the second one is unavailable. It's in the Russian archives for films and images. It's preserved in Moscow, but I never got an opportunity to actually get a copy. I know that Alexander Zoom worked a lot on Soviet cinema at the time, and he wrote about it as well. And he even showed it at the Historia de la Grande Guerre at some point. And at the same time, in 1930s, Russian soldiers of the Expeditionary Force, they started to publish their memoirs, and the Bolsheviks supported the publication of the memoirs because they were showing this perfidious nature of the imperialist war, that the soldiers were sent to fight for, big capital, this bourgeois interests. That image was one of the few images that came out from the First World War that was used politically by the Soviet government at the time, because it kind of fed into this narrative of the imperialist war and bad capitalists, bad Anglo-French Entente troops who later turned to be the enemies of Soviet Russia, obviously. And it's interesting how in the film as well, the Anglo-French troops, they portrayed together, right? So they're not fighting separately. So the officers, the French and British officers, they fight together, and the French and British soldiers also fight together, sort of like mixed in the trenches. So because the Entente is just this kind of the image of this horrible kind of entity, horrible threatening entity threatening to the Soviet Russia. That is the details don't matter in that case.
It's interesting. I thought it was really peculiar when they lumped the French and the British together, and they're very. It's obviously super clear because of the uniforms, who's who. But then right at the start, they then show the Scots marching in to Tipperary, and I wondered if that was they're pointing at some sort of oppressed nation by the English. So they're putting the Scots fighting for the British. Is there another bit of subtext there?
Yeah, I've probably told most of you before, I'm at times I'm a slightly fake historian because most of my background is in media studies, and then I moved into history. But fortunately, my media training and my keen historical eye did enable me to spot some of these subtle political messages that were buried beneath the surface of Sniper. There might be, as Sofya says, some kind of communistic message in there about the shared suffering of the proletariat, but you really have to dig quite deep into it.
And drinking and listening to the cabaret music, which also there is a song there that refers to Paris. So if I go to Paris, and I will hug my Madeleine one day. So that's interesting how they kind of imagine them.
They bring the Chateau Generals right to the front, don't they? And there's sit in the grandiose dugouts all together.
So I'm the person who didn't get to watch the film for all sorts of reasons. But actually, my question is about distribution at the time, really, because a lot of that narrative turns up in 1930s Britain when the British Communist Party, among others, is attempting to recruit ex-servicemen. And you see, this narrative of the capitalist war, which it's not the Entente against the Soviet so much as the officer classes versus the working classes, and the British ex-serviceman as emblematic, promised homes fit for heroes and comes back to unemployment in the Jarrow marches. And I'm just wondering, how widely did these, both films like Sniper and also the memoirs, circulate? Were these being passed around? Were these being used as attempts to recruit internationally? Was there any intention or any motivation on the part of the Soviet government to use them in that way at all, and to gain sympathy of working classes in the former allies who were no longer their allies because they were representative of capitalist evil?
Thank you. That's actually a good question that kind of gives us a better perspective on what was going on at the time, because Sniper clearly is a film that was created for internal consumption. And in terms of the memoirs, actually, I saw the numbers because on all of the Soviet books, you can see the numbers of the copies printed, and we're speaking about tens of thousands of copies. So by the end of 1930s, there were probably 100,000 of books about Russian Expeditionary Force, copies of different books that were in circulation. And also, quite recently, a colleague of mine, Gwendal Piedier, he discovered a book of the memoirs of the Russian Expeditionary Force soldier in Ukrainian. So he was Ukrainian, and he came back and he published his memoirs about how horrible French authorities, they imprisoned the Russian revolutionary soldiers, which was true, and sent them to North Africa, and how they struggled in North Africa. But it was published in Ukrainian and by Ukrainian the press of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So it was for internal circulation primarily. But at the same time, the Soviet government indeed tried to find the veterans who were kind of empathetic to the communist ideas. So the veterans, as we know, they were involved in a political life across Europe, and some of them were on the right wing and some of them on the left wing. And in France, I think it's a very poignant situation because you have two associations of the veterans that existed in France. One was the National Association of the Anciens Combattants, of the veterans, basically. And the other one was the Communist Association, which was smaller. I'm trying to remember what was the name. I think it was the International Association of the veterans, basically. But that was supported by Comintern. So, and I seen the archives in the party archives in Russia, that sort of like how Comintern was in touch with those pro-communist associations of veterans, and how they were trying, and also because they were communists, they tried to underline this international kind of character of the veterans movement. And I think they had a few meetings. They had meetings in Paris and they had meetings in Germany as well. So in that case, the veterans were associated not on a national scale, but on an international scale. The German veterans and the French veterans were kind of clumped together as the victims of the imperialist war. And with the Veterans Association, there was also like attached to the association of the war victims, so the wives, the children, the displaced people, the refugees. So definitely on the international kind of scene, the Soviet Communist Party via Comintern was trying to get sympathy of those pro-communist veterans, but not with the story of the Russian Expeditionary Force per se, but like I think with a more kind of direct political influence.
How does this film fit in with the other sort of Russian First World War films? If you're looking at them as a sort of a canon of the period.
But you see, there are no First World War films that were made at the time per se. If there were scenes of the First War included, they were the scenes before the Civil War, because obviously for the Bolsheviks, the most important war was the Civil War against the Entente and against the Whites. That's why Sniper is in many ways a unique film, because it portrays, and it's basically set only during the wartime, and it kind of uses the imagery of the Western Front, which is very recognizable for anybody from Western Europe as well. And sometimes when I watched the film, I thought it's so many basic tropes that we now associate with the Western Front are shown in that film. So in even in the 1930s, but I think that imagery actually came from the French film in the 1920s and 30s that you guys also discussed in the podcast. They kind of made their way over, and they were, I think, in some ways accessible in Russia. So because they had a military consultant on the set of Sniper, but he was not a soldier of Russian Expeditionary Force. And the fact that they put the British and the French together in the trenches kind of shows that they were not completely like aware of what the Western Front was like. And there was a problem during the war because people in Russia and even the military personnel in Russia were not completely aware of what the trench fighting was like until the end of 1915 and 1916, where Russia herself experienced some of the trench warfare. But obviously there is a political decision in that as well. So we speak about 1930s, the dominant narrative is the narrative of the imperialist war. So the beginning, not the end of the First War, but the beginning of the war was celebrated in the papers, saying that this is the beginning of the imperialist war that eventually brought the Soviet kind of republic to life. So in that respect, the First World War memory existed not on a government kind of plane, but in the personal dimension. And that's what Karen Petrona wrote in her book, the Great War in Russian Memory, sort of showing that the memory existed, but it was not obviously promoted by the government. And in that respect, I have a personal story actually, because my great granddad fought in the First World War, which I didn't really realize until it was very late. But my granddad, his son, is still alive, and we had a relative, and they from the Ural mountains from that region, and we have a relative who visited a house one day, and we were showing. And at the time, I was doing a little piece on the songs of the First World War, and we were showing, looking at old pictures, and my granddad suddenly said that he remembered a song that his dad used to sing when obviously my granddad was born in 1930, so it was like 15 years after the war. began, and he sang it. And he sang it to the tune that I didn't have in the big collection of the First World War books. So I didn't know what the tune of the song was. I only had the text that were collected by ethnographers in the 1960s. And it's interesting how that kind of course, it's a unique and isolated incident, but that's an incident that shows that the experience of the First World War in the life of the veterans who were still alive in the 1960s and 70s, they didn't, like, it existed, it was there, it wasn't their memory. But as soon as they were gone, their children already didn't really have a clear image of what this imperialist war was like. So the memory of the First World War sort of like got not erased but faded with the people, with the generation who actually was involved in the war. So that's my sort of kind of personal understanding of the situation.
One of the interesting things I enjoyed or found notable whilst watching Sniper was it made me think a lot about our obscure films episode where we watched films from the 20s and the 30s and how different. I mean, I know effectively nothing about the history of Russian cinema, but even the kind of the composition of the scenes, how quick the cuts were, you'd get a second at most before it would zoom in on somebody's face, and then you get a second of that, and then it would zoom in, and it was constantly chopping and chopping and chopping and chopping. Whereas some of the films that we watched, like Wings, The Big Parade, Patrol, which are of a similar age, were far more theatre based, always, very long scenes, very long cuts, lots of dialogue, lots of kind of people interacting with each other, which you didn't get a great deal in Sniper. I mean, it wasn't quite, full Sergei Eisenstein match cut to match cut Battleship Potemkin type thing, but there was a real kind of divergence of how Russian cinema approached a similar topic in the 1920s and 30s, which I thought was really interesting.
It seems slightly confused. It doesn't know whether it's a talkie or a silent film. It even though it's 1931, it's got a foot in both camps. Yet it's got the most amazing audio transition at one point. The sound design is fantastic, where they're listening to the gramophone, and in their dugout are all the generals, sort of getting drunk, and they're picturing the dancers, aren't they? And then the record ends, and you just get that needle going round scratching, and then they transition that scratch to rain in no man's land and the troops. And I just sat there going, that's fantastic. As rough as all this film has been in sort of production wise, that's just genius. I bet the guy who came up with it is sitting there going, well, that's me. That's my career, mate. That's fantastic. It's brilliant.
Although what often happened with those bits was I would simply go, that was fantastic. I'm just going to pause the YouTube for a minute and go to the translation that Sofya has sent us so I can read what's going on.
Obviously, the communists and the Bolsheviks realized the use of the cinema as a propaganda instrument very early on. And Battleship Potemkin is one of the examples of that type of cinema. And Sniper, obviously, as well. So the idea, I think, was that to kind of why it's so many cuts and everything, because it's about the imagery more than the dialogue, because I think the images are very like telling in that film, and the way kind of people are dressed, and how at the beginning the sniper is dressed, in a new Russian imperial uniform, and then in the end when he's already a worker, he's not even in civilian settings, he's still wearing his worker's clothes, and he still has dirty face, because that tells like about his hard work at the factory, at the workshop, at the railway workshop. That's where he was working. And they have quite a lot of music, but at the workshop they kept the sound of the hammers. They kept the industrial sounds, because at the time, indeed, in the Soviet Union, there was this trend of the kind of industrial music, and the sounds of the industry, the sounds of the production was considered to be kind of akin to the musical piece. So I think they kind of consciously decided not to add any music to that, and rather to keep the sound of the machines there. So in terms of music, it's a very curious thing.
There's a standing joke in sort of British conservative middlebrow fiction that's having a pop at sort of communist aesthetic in the period, about intellectuals who go to hear symphonies on an anvil and other sorts of creative industrial instrumentations, but it just keeps coming up in British middlebrow conservative literature. So yeah, very much an internationally recognized aspect of Soviet culture.
It's interesting actually how the perception of the First World War changed in the 1940s, because it's I think because there were films made. There was a play made dedicated to Brusselov's breakthrough in 1940s during the war, because the image of the First World War was now used to mobilize the masses against the Germans, because we beat the Germans many times before. So usually it goes into 1760s, and then obviously the First World War, and then kind of the Second World War, we're going to beat Hitler as well. So the sort of like the memory was mobilized once again. In 1960s, the sort of like it came back to this kind of communist ideological appreciation of the war again, and only in 1980s with the perestroika, the true kind of interest. It was, I guess, always there, but because of the boom in the publications of the literature that was previously banned, and in general, kind of the relative liberalization of the Communist Party policy in the 80s led to the really a spike in interest in the First World War, and lots of reenactment of the First World War and the Civil War as well. So in terms of public memory in 1980s, I think reenactments groups were quite big on the memory of the First World War. So where I grew up in Moscow, there is a big cemetery of the First World War that was destroyed in the 1930s because nobody cared about this imperialist war anymore. So, but the bodies, the remains were left in the ground, but the headstones, including quite unique headstones for the aviators who were buried there, who died in Moscow hospitals and were buried there, and they had propellers at the headstone, they were destroyed. The cemetery now is a park, and a part of it was taking 1950s. There was the expansion of Moscow, so new blocks of flats were built around it. But in 1980s, it was a reenactment group who started the pilgrimages to the site, and they involved people from the local church as well. So the church was involved as well, and they were the ones who first put the cross back in the middle of the cemetery. But then in 2000s, the state came in, and all of this initial kind of wild memorialization was moved, and it's now a more or less unified ensemble of the park, which is not particularly aesthetic, but it's unified. And in 2014, during the centenary of the war, the state brought the remains of Nikolai Nikolaevich, the Grand Duke, the Supreme Commander of the Russian Army in 1914-1915, from France to be reburied at the said cemetery. So it's interesting how kind of in terms of space, we also see the change of the attitude, not only of the public, but of the state as well, which obviously in Russia still plays a huge role in the commemoration and the memory of the war, and of especially like of the Second World War, but the First World War as well.
I find the idea of Russian in the 80s reenactment groups quite fascinating. Because presumably they must have been state sanctioned. In which case, if you're reenacting, you need to have some Germans to reenact against. So who in communist Russia is going to volunteer to play the Germans?
It's second half of the 80s, so it's after the perestroika.
Okay.
And the group that I have in mind, they actually reenacted the Junkers, so the students of the military school in Moscow, who defended Moscow from the Bolsheviks in the end of 1917, and who died. Some of them died in defending Kremlin. Funnily enough, some of them were women. It's another story of the First World War in Russia, like roles of women. But so they only reenacted them. And in December 1917, when some of the Junkers died, they were buried at this fraternal cemetery. That's why they were so kind of interested in the story of the cemetery. So they were not reenacting the First World War; they were reenacting just after the period just after that. You see, when the Soviet Union collapsed, so I think this kind of memory of the Civil War kind of re-emerged with a bigger swing than the First World War. But the First World War sort of like jumped on the back wagon, and it was also kind of present there through, like, by the virtue of the interest of the Civil War. So.
Something else I got from the sniper, which I might be, you're all allowed to shoot me down here, but I thought the sniper presented, it was almost like proto Blackadder presenting the war as futile. But then at the same time, slightly oddly, it doesn't come across as anti-war, which didn't seem to sit very well.
Yeah, actually, you're right. I don't think it's not. Yes, it's not anti-war, because in the end, in 1930s, it's saying we have to be prepared for everything, and they repel supposedly a Romanian kind of. They call it the border.
But is there a certain masculinity to him at the end as he strokes his rifle, sort of representing sort of good Republicans stepping up to come out of retirement to defend the country, sort of a good Republican spirit?
Oh, I think actually it's not come out of retirement. It means the constant mobilization of everyone. So I think in 1930s, we can see that switch, because early 1920s, it's clearly anti-imperialist war. It's clearly anti-imperialist message. But in 1930s, there was a transformation going on, and the message from, rather than we don't want war anymore at all, switched to we're ready to everything. We're ready to repel any attack. So he is a worker, but he also runs a shooting club, and he is the person who suddenly, grabs his rifle. He's at the factory and he runs through the border to repel the Romanian and the White Russian raiders in 1930. So in many ways, the film does make sense, especially the second half of the film. And I think one of the reasons why it's kind of a mix of a talkie and non-talkie and a silent film, because it began to be shot as a silent film, and you can definitely see it at first, and then the last bit was shot as a spoken film. So there's more dialogue in the second part rather than the first part. Of course, that's a question for more like cinema historians rather than the First World War.
So that point of the anti-war messaging of the film, because you mentioned that there's this celebration in the wider sort of propaganda narrative. There's the celebration of the war as, of the start of the war, because it is the motivation for the revolution. So I'm wondering if it becomes even more difficult to, it's always difficult for any country to have something fully anti-war when there's still veterans alive, to say, everything you suffered, everything you went through is futile, and none of the positives that you might have taken out of it are true. And that then gets complicated if the other message you want to get across is that actually the one great purpose of this war is that it brought about the inevitable rise of the Soviet, and this is where history was headed, and an inevitability. So it becomes even more difficult to say this is a bad war. You can say the enemy is bad, and the enemy isn't necessarily who you think the enemy is, but it really becomes really difficult to say the war itself is bad if the result you get out of it is the one you wanted in the end.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. That's actually a good point, because interestingly enough, because I saw some letters and some memoirs of the Russian Expeditionary Force soldiers, and they were saying that they were celebrated when they came back because they were the victims of the imperialism. And then by the end of 1920s, they're saying, oh, you've forgotten us. And they were the only group of the veterans that were allowed to have an association, a formally sanctioned group association in Soviet Russia. And one of the reasons is because the Soviet Union used them as a sort of like a scarecrow in negotiations with France and Britain at the time, because they were saying, oh, look, they're the victims of your treatment. So you sent people to prisons, you sent people to forced labor. So you are not kind of as nice as you present yourself to be. So we are also suffered. So we, as Soviets, also suffered. And there was a society of the victims of intervention. They sort of like these soldiers were attached to. But with the rest of the Russian Imperial Army, officers and veterans, well, not even officers, lots of them emigrated, but the soldiers and the veterans of the Russian Imperial Army, I think they didn't even get that justification. They were, unless they fought in a civil war, they were gone from the public eye very soon, including disabled and non-disabled. Everyone was sort of like kind of shoved to the side, because the heroes were those who fought with the Red Army. And interesting with the pensions, because I have this little side project that looks at the social care of the disabled veterans after the war. The pensions for the Red Army soldiers who, for instance, got their disability fighting with the Reds during the Civil War were much higher than those who got their disability during the First World War. So obviously, interestingly enough, so at some point when the disability becomes so severe, it doesn't matter, because they usually send them to the care homes, and it doesn't matter anymore where or how you got the disability. So it kind of equalizes everyone, and their prior status doesn't matter. But when they still kind of integrate in the society, there are differences. The Russian Expeditionary Force soldiers, they fought for the recognition, and they fought for the pensions, and they fought for the kind of some benefits, and they didn't, because the Ministry of, it was called People's Commissariat for the Army and Navy, said that you can't be equalized with the Red Army soldiers because you fought for the imperialist army, so we can't give you pensions. So they didn't get anything. So people who fought in the First World War got nothing. Actually, after the Second World War, I think they got something, but I think it was just basically regular pensions. So it wasn't like very like a special status or for them. But that's the thing, that the veterans of the First World War, they existed, and sometimes in the 60s in the films you get bits of mentions of the First World War. And recently there was a film called Dear Comrades that Russia sent to, I think it was nominated for an Oscar, it was one of the contestants, was shortlisted for an Oscar for the best foreign film. And there was an episode, because it's about 1960s and about the rising in Novocherkassk, which used to be the capital of the Don Cossack area. And it happened in the 60s, and the workers who worked there, they sort of risen against the Soviets, or rebelled against the Soviets, because the prices on the meat were very high and their salaries were cut. But there is an episode in the film when one of the father of the main character, he puts on his Don Cossack's uniform, and he puts on all of his imperial medals. And he sits in the kitchen and he drinks, and he thinks that he's going to be, arrested, that he's going to die soon. But essentially how that memory existed, especially in the areas like Cossack areas, despite the decossacization, despite the extreme violence that the Bolsheviks sort of like unleashed against the Cossacks in these particular areas that existed. And now that kind of Novocherkassk rebellion and the Cossack movement in the 1920s in the area, they now merge in the film that Andrei Konchalovsky made. That's a curious episode, I thought. And it's very recent, 2019, I think, 2020.
Just kind of thinking about what you're saying there. So if you're also coming to kind of Jessica's point earlier on about the kind of the tension between so, how are we going to reconcile the experiences of veterans who are going to still exist within the country versus the memories that are being kind of reproduced. And I'm wondering whether or not, to what extent the revolution provides a method of streamlining some of the popular memory that doesn't actually necessarily exist in, say, Britain or France. Because if we talked a fair amount about British and French popular memory, and then there is a tension between how can suffering on the Somme or at Verdun or at Passchendaele be reconciled with a war that we won and was apparently worth it, and how do you kind of deal with that aspect? And then over the years it becomes generally farcical in generals or idiots and stuff like that. But you don't need to worry about reconciling that post-revolution in Russia, because all the bad things that happened, of course they were bad things. They were done by illegitimate imperialist scum, and we rose up against them and shot them before. That's how we deal with getting encircled in 1914. It's how we deal with multiple terrible offences on the Eastern Front in 1915. It wasn't us that did them. We'd have done it better, but unfortunately we were at the mercy of these awful imperialists. And I wonder if that acts as a very handy way of just kind of stripping away everything you don't want and going, well, yeah, of course it was bad. They did it.
Yeah. So the soldiers of the imperialist army were considered to be kind of, sometimes they were called victims of the imperialism, because basically they were drafted and they were sent to fight, and some of them didn't want to fight but didn't get anything. So if you, for instance, were sent to prison by the imperial government, you were considered to be like a proper victim, and you'll get like some benefits. And there was again association of the former political prisoners that was destroyed in 1937. but the soldiers didn't get anything. So I think it is a useful instrument at the time for the Soviets. There was all imperialist, and it's not like we didn't really care about it as much, because the only important thing that came out of it is that it brought on the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's in historiography as well. It's interesting how it was kind of represented and portrayed, because in 1920s and 30s, there was lots of military analysis of what happened in the First World War, because that gave the nascent Soviet military the examples to practice on. So there was lots of discussion, lots been written in 1920s and 30s. But then Second World War sort of like reduced the value of the First World War experience, obviously, because it was more recent and much bigger conflict. And in 1960s, we see some interest that arise again for the 50th anniversary, that arise again towards the First World War. But all of that research had to be sort of like within the framework of this kind of communist perception of the war. So, but usually what the historians did, they would write the first chapter or the introduction about how Marx understood the war and how Lenin, what he wrote about the imperialist war, and then they will write the actual research. And one of the books from 1960, I'm still using it because it's still pretty good, but I think it's first about 150 pages when the historian kind of writes. His name is Ivan Rostonov, and he writes about the Marxist understanding of the war, and then he actually goes and does his analysis of what happened on strategy and military level. So that was still there, so that wasn't inescapable.
Talking about the shift in memory across the 20th century, what's the status now? How important is the history of the First World War in Russian popular culture at the moment?
It is interesting, because Russia doesn't have a living memory of the First World War, if you want. So people often do not kind of realize and do not associate themselves with the First World War, unlike it happens in Britain, because you have someone, a relative that you heard of that you never met, but you have a picture and you think that you sort of like, you feel your attachment to the First World War. In Russia, that happens only with the Second World War. On a national scale, on a very wide level, there is a movement there used to be a kind of a popular initiative, which is now seized by the government, and it's sort of like a government initiative that's called an immortal regiment, so where people kind of come out and they march with the pictures of their relatives who died or who took part in the Second World War. So they have this attachment with the Second World War, but the First World War basically non-existent. And therefore, people and government and public generally, they lack the language about how to talk about the First World War. They do not really have clear associations with it. So they use, and especially the government and pro-government initiatives, they use the language that they use to describe the Second World War, and they apply to the First World War. And it's very interesting to look at, because they kind of this framework of heroes repelling the enemy, it's being applied to the First World War. But obviously the First World War is a very different conflict, and it's not life or death fight as the Second World War is usually framed. So it looks very lame. It's very hard to discuss with people as well, because again, turning back to the cemetery situation. So in our area, there is an abandoned cinema theatre at the edge of the former cemetery, at the edge of the former park, and the locals were trying for years to turn that abandoned building into a museum of the First World War, which is a great initiative. But there've been some tribulations with the property rights and everything, so it's still there. It's being slowly decaying, so the building's still there. And I met with some of the local activists, because I live in the area as well, and we had a conversation about what they want this museum to look like. And the language that they use was the language of the Second World War. The people who like local activists, but they perceive when they kind of collect, the general perception, the general idea of how we portray the war, and that is the portrayal of the Second World War. And for them, and we were having this conversation about, are all the people who buried in the cemetery, are they all heroes? And they said, definitely, 100%, they're all heroes. They all have to be commemorated, because that's how the Second World War is portrayed at the moment. And I'm saying, and told them, well, some of them died of illnesses. So quite a lot of them died of the typhoid epidemic in Moscow at the time. They're quite different, so they're different people. And there is a section of the cemetery where the people who were shot by the Bolsheviks in 1917, 1918 were buried. They're also heroes. all of them are heroes. So because it's an easy, it's an easy framework to put everything in. Every war that Russia fought falls within that easy kind of narrative. Doesn't matter if that's Napoleon, so we're repelling Napoleon, we're repelling the British and the Turkish and the French in the Crimean War, not very successful, but that happens with the First World War and any other conflict. Because the government is using the image of the Second World War to kind of legitimize its own actions. And because everybody the hero and we love the army, and the First World War falls into that. So there are two pro-government, I'll call them proxy government NGOs, because they technically are NGOs, but they're funded by the government and they're headed by the top bureaucrats. One of them is called Russian Historical Society, and it's headed by the head of the Russian intelligence service. Now, his name is Naryshkin, which is also the name of one of the top imperial officials. Another is the Russian Society for Military History, and they try to present themselves as continuation of the imperial societies that existed prior to 1917, but obviously they're not. And they're funded by the government, and they usually promote the historical initiatives. So they were in charge of building memorials in Kaliningrad Oblast, where is the only place where Russia actually has a bit of a battlefield of the First World War. And that's in Kaliningrad, which used to be former East Prussia. And it's mostly German cemeteries. So not that many Russian cemeteries there. So they were in charge of building monuments there. They were in charge of the centenary of the war, which was celebrated more widely than the centenary of the revolution. Because in the current narrative, when everybody's a hero, revolution is not really good, because it really mixes the whole thing up. And it's basically, and it's interesting how it changes, how this perception changed at the time, because when I was at school, I think like following the kind of late 80s and 90s, the Civil War was portrayed as the white forces were good guys because they remained loyal to the emperor. And I think now it changed to everyone's bad because they upset the status quo.
It's interesting because there are bits of that which, as a historian of British memory of the First World War, actually sound quite familiar. We've also moved out of living memory. Yes, you might have had a great grandfather or great uncle who fought in the war, but they're not alive anymore. And my generation is probably the last that would have had much memory of talking to them about the war. So it's all coming second, third hand now. It's family history passed down. And that everyone was a hero narrative. Oh my word. All victims, all heroes. Yeah, which I've written quite a lot about in one way and another.
And the lack of a societal touchstone or a societal interest in it is pure America in the lead up to the centenary. So I imagine both Jessica and Angus were, as you were describing that, sort of, it was like, let's take the American interpretation and the British interpretation, we'll mix it a bit and then add some weirdness and see what comes tumbling out the end.
And Chris, you may be able to help in terms of what the French were doing, because is Britain the outlier here in having this sense of the First World War is the war we remember versus the Second World War, which, the Americans have that sense of the Second World War as the archetype that everything gets fitted to, although they also have the Civil War in there. I'm wondering if it's really that Britain's the outlier rather than Russia being the outlier in this narrative.
I mean, possibly Sofya's going to be able to speak to this as well, because given her research and multiple language skills. But I think it both is and it isn't, in that the First World War isn't overlooked in France at all to the extent you see it in America. It appears in different ways. We've been talking at some point about doing a graphic novel episode. French graphic novel market of the First World War is amazing and weird, and I really, really, really want to look at it. But having conversations with various people, I remember having a conversation with Franziska Heimberger a while ago. And by a while ago, that could generally be any point in the last 15 years, where she was talking about the movement in and around the centenary of a lot of kind of leading French historians to begin fully moving away from the First World War and to begin kind of reconceiving and re-examining the Second World War. But obviously they've got the the problems of occupation, they've got the problems of collaboration. The Second World War for them is not as easy a remember for us because of the awful thing that happened. The fall of France, the occupation, Vichy, Vichy syndrome. So I think that Britain is the outlier in that we take societally weirdly beneficial things from both the First and the Second World War that I don't think happens with the other. Even when we're looking at the First World War, God, it was just terrible and it was awful and the generals were idiots, but God bless our brave heroic soldier dead. There's always something we can hang our hat on. And the Second World War is Britain's crowning glory in the 20th century, as at the same time as being America's crowning glory in the 20th century and the Soviet Union's crowning glory in the 20th century. But ours is somehow more crowning and more glorious than the others. But yeah, I think Britain is the outlier in the fact that we generally walk away from it feeling vaguely pleased with how we're doing the remembering thing. I don't know if Sofya would agree with that.
It's interesting because I like to observe the commemoration practices in Britain. And the thing is what I see recently, but I think it's a global trend actually. It's the political use of history, right? And that's something that began with Poland in the early 2000s and that was really quickly co-opted by the Russian government. And it's more evident in the authoritarian regimes like Russia, because it's more like, especially with a state as powerful as in Russia, it's quite easy to trace. But what happened in Britain, I think, especially in the past few years, and I think it's what would the apex of this situation is this called blitz spirit narrative that existed in the beginning of COVID. But that's because it's sort of like it uses kind of similar techniques of reducing the complexity of the war to something that's very, you said, the societal features, like the useful societal features of the war and its memory. And that's what basically the political usage of history is about. And that's what's happening in Russia. And that's why the hero's narrative, it's so easy and useful. And you say that, well, obviously, again, I'm in a position of the engaged observer, I would say, in that situation. And you say that the Second World War is not as prominent as the First World War. So I used to work in the Imperial War Museum in the bookshop during my master's degree. And it was a good experience in terms of like public memory and how people engage with it. Obviously, now they opened a new exhibit in the Second World War. But even when the new exhibition wasn't around and there was not a consistent narrative, but just lots of very unique and peculiar objects that told the story of the Second World War, whilst the First World War was a more like arranged exhibition. Lots of people who came specifically for the Second World War. And generally, I remember the conversation which started with a question, where is that plane that Tom Hardy flew in Dunkirk? So, and then people genuinely came to see objects that were related to the Second World War. I think they went to the First World exhibition as well. But obviously, I mean, it is definitely in terms of the images, maybe not the family connections, but the imagery of the Second World War is very, very prominent in Britain. And but obviously in Russia, the difference is that there is imagery and family connection, and there is the constant sort of like feeding of that dragon of memory of the Second World War, that sometimes it feels like it's very alive and it feels like it was not very long ago, even by younger people. But that's obviously a fake impression that is created by political use of memory.
I'm not sure Britain is entirely in the clear on this one, given our current Prime Minister's attempt at writing history and the subject matter chosen. And of course that politicization of history goes back to Churchill himself, who was a historian, rather better one than Johnson. Do I say?
So topic we seem to be skirting round, when you talk about the British memory of the war, you've got that rather annoyingly jingoistic thing of, two world wars, one World Cup, the British won, hurrah. What's the Russian memory now of, did they win? Is it because obviously they might have lost the war, won the revolution, but that starts to get quite messy when you started to delineate between what you're winning and losing, and presumably a lot of the troops that might have lost the war fight to win the revolution, so they're the same. And for those men, one would be a continuation rather than a stop and a start. There's no end of one war and start another. They just carry on.
it's something that I think about often, especially with the framework of the longer First World War that I particularly like, and I think applies very well to the Russian case, because you're right. There was, sometimes in terms of people got demobbed from the Imperial Army and recruited into the Red Army like 3 months later. But basically, it's the continuation of the conflict, and it's a continuous mobilization of the population. But if you ask an average person on the street what they think about the First World War, they would say they don't know who won, but probably Russia won.
Well, they're on the Russian side. They're on the winning side with the Allies. They could hang their coat with that.
Yeah, that's the thing. And the idea is that if not for the Bolsheviks, it's not for the revolution, Russia would have won. So it's almost a win. It feels like a win. I think a more like, again, it depends, because I think in my position, I'm obviously, I'm not just an engaged observer, I'm also a researcher of the First World War. So I think it's much more prominent that it actually is. And sometimes my friends remind me that it's actually not. And it's not that big. And again, more, I think more like general consensus of like more people who are more aware about the words that it was lost. And some people say why we should remember it. It was a lot, like we lost that war. So that's another kind of narrative they can get in a conversation. So, but the revolution is generally, I think, across different stratas and kind of layers of the society, is considered as a bad thing, as a tragic thing. So you can't, in that, because the Soviet Union is no more, the narrative of we won the revolution, we won the civil war is no longer there. It's a tragic episode. It's a fratricide, if you want. So that's the kind of the common narrative of the Civil War. So the First World War in that case is trying, like, people try to separate it because it's easier to understand. So we won this, we almost won this, but then this horrible thing happened and everything kind of didn't go as planned. So basically, I think that's the idea. And people remember, so there are bits that people kind of remember and clearly associate with the war. So they clearly associate the Brussels breakthrough with the war. That's probably the one thing that the people are going to say, that's the Brussels breakthrough. And what is interesting in Soviet Union, and when you were saying about the communist, I forgot to say this, about the communist veterans or socialist veterans in Britain who were thinking and writing about the First World War, the book, the memoirs of the First World War, the British memoirs of the First World War that are popular and were published by the Soviets in Russia were Richard Aldington's Death of a Hero, which is not well known in Britain at all. But it was published in the 60s and then in the 80s again. And it's one of the books that people can name. If they read it, they can probably associate it with the First World War, along with Everything's Quiet at the Western Front. Remarque is widely popular. He was widely popular in Soviet Union. He was first published in the 1920s for the same reason, to kind of show this brutality of the imperialist war. So he was published and republished en masse. So the copies, like numerous copies, were published, and he still remains popular. And people will associate it with the First World War, but I think on a general public level, that people fail to merge it into one picture. So what happened in the East and what happened in the West, they fail to merge it in one picture because there are so many images of the Western Front that flow obviously through, like, they are part of the Russian kind of memory of the content that people consume. So people go and watch 1917 and they can probably associate it with Remarque, Not Quiet of the Western Front. Everything's quiet, no news from the Western Front. I think that's because I read it obviously in Russian, so I'll forget. All Quiet on the Western Front.
It's all quiet is how it tends to get translated. But I have this horrible feeling we're going to get angry emails from modernist studies listeners saying, but of course everybody knows Richard Aldington's Death of a Hero.
Yeah, but so it was Remarque's, Richard Aldington's, and a guy called Arnold Zweig. So not Stefan Zweig, Arnold Zweig. So his memoirs as well, so German memoirs. And Barbusse, of course. Barbusse was a big prominent writer. He visited Soviet Union in the 1930s. He met by the Russian Expeditionary Force soldiers in Soviet Union. He corresponded with some of the members of the Russian Expeditionary Force whilst in France. So Feu was published, translated en masse, and there's one of the books about the First World War that's kind of is there, but I think it will be Aldington and Remark that's they're probably the most popular. And interestingly enough, but there is something that I recently kind of thought about. Schweik's The Adventures of Soldier Schweik by Gashek are very popular as well, and people did not really associate it with the First World War. So it's a funny book with a funny illustration, and it's often read by youths, by something they've been recommended to read at school, I think when you're 13 or 14. And at that time you haven't studied the First World War, so you can't really merge it together. So that's going back to my childhood and my formative years at school when we didn't really study the First World War. It's bits and bobs of information. They come, so you know something, but you fail to kind of paint the big picture of the First World War. So you have Gashek, and you have in 1930s, they also published quite a lot of Czech and Serbian and former Austro-Hungarian memoirs, especially of the Slavs of the First World War, and they kind of nationalist struggle. But again, it's coming from different sources, and it's not there is no place, neither at school or somewhere else, where you can come to and kind of piece it all together and say that's the First World War, that's one conflict.
That does bear comparison with American culture, in the sense that I read All Quiet at school, but it was sort of a very brief moment in a modern history course, and that was sort of it for the First World War. I think I got something from my art history class, and again, but as you say, little bits and pieces, and it wasn't until I got to university that I actually learned anything about the war as a world-changing conflict.
I think it's super interesting that Barbusse gets, but makes perfect sense that Barbusse gets kind of adapted to a Russian audience, because the British don't warm to Lefeu at all. There's one of my favourite Times literary reviews is by John Middleton Murray about Under Fire, and he says that if an Englishman felt the same way as Monsieur Barbusse does about war, not only would he not write about it, he wouldn't take part in it, which is a beautiful one-line review as you're going to find anywhere. But because of the nature of the storyline of Lefeu, I can completely understand why that might be reasonably appealing in a post-revolutionary Russia, about, in the same way that Sniper was all about the kind of the shared suffering of people under awful conditions, and wouldn't it be better if the workers didn't have to go through this type of stuff? Interestingly
enough, one of the Soviet marshals, so how I got again interested in the Russian Expeditionary Force, the article that I read was telling a story of the Soviet Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, who became the defense minister under Khrushchev, who fought in the Russian Expeditionary Force. And he did a lot. So he published his memoir. So it's a fictionalized autobiography where he tells, and it's mostly about his experience at the Western Front. That kind of legitimized the memoirs of the First World War, but it came out in the 60s. So people were already too old to write and publish their memoirs. That's why there is not enough content on the Eastern Front that was published in Soviet Union that is accessible. And again, in the 80s and in the 90s, all the content on the First World War came from the Western Front. And that's why people now, they have this image, the same image that people have in Western Europe, about the trenches, the mud and blood and everything, horrible experiences, the Western Front. But they don't know what the Eastern Front fighting was like. So they have only bits and pieces and some imagery, maybe from the war games, because it was a war gaming company that shot a film about Auschwitz fairly recently. So, but it's not. So kind of.
Does the snow on their boots myth have any currency in Russia?
No. It's the best book that's been written by the Russian Expeditionary Force to the date. We tried to translate it into Russian, but it's really hard to get the publishers agreement and the rights to do that. But they didn't make it. So I learned about the myth when I read Jamie Copfield's book about Russian Expeditionary Force and how the rumors of the Russian soldiers arriving to Britain. There's actually a ground behind that, because the Kitchener requested a regiment of Cossacks from the Russians. But that thing doesn't exist. I think the biggest myth of the First World War, if we go that way, is the Auschwitz, and that's the myth that was birthed in the internet era, and it got popular because of the internet era and because everybody was not retweeting. I think it was on Russian analog of Facebook were sharing the story of the attack of the dead. So gas Russian soldiers in 1915 kind of rose up and repelled the Germans, and that was called the Attack of the Dead.
I was just going to say that would lead quite nicely if we ever want to do that episode on zombies in the First World War that I've mentioned a couple of times before.
My nightmares for the next week sorted.
As we close upon the hour, in fact, do you think we've are we milked the topic enough for today? I mean, I get the feeling there's lots more to go through.
I'm looking forward to an episode on Tardy, so that I'm getting the feeling.
I think the three of us should just do it. I think we should get some graphic novels and do it. I've already got the Tardy ones, and I love them. They're just amazingly disturbing, but I love them. Graphic novels.
We mentioned that last time around, and I rampantly went out and started filling off my collection of Charlie's War.
As an aside, if any of us now get invitations to a Russian History Society that's run by the head of Russian intelligence, should we ignore it? What's the etiquette?
I was getting a little bit worried. I was about to ask if any of my fellow presenters were getting a little bit worried about the implications for our personal safety after this episode goes out.
Or mainly towards our guests' personal safety, because...
Indeed, absolutely, yes.
So you touched upon what we might be talking about next. I think we have a plethora of topics, Chris, don't we, lined up? I noted we have... potentially, I even had to write it down because it was so long a title. Artistic development of ancient Greek and Roman imagery on civic cultural artifacts of the Great War during and after the conflict. That's ceramics, printed media, and medals potentially coming up with Giles from Warwick. Who's on your cards? We need to get our ducks in order, really.
At the moment, I've got various kind of emails and the like out to people that I'm waiting to hear back from. But I think a little one on graphic novels at some point would be fun. Because I've super enjoyed this one, has made me think is whether or not we should invite Vander on to talk about Italian cinema and the First World War. I like our little run at the moment of countries I know literally nothing about, and then sitting down and watching a weird film on YouTube, and discovering this whole new way of portraying the war.
I will see if I can track down my contact on zombies in the First World War. Or we could try and get Kate McDonald on to talk about cyborgs. That could be fun.
Yeah. There is also, I mentioned it, let me go on to the website. I mentioned it in our Star Wars episode. There is a brilliant book about the First World War popular horror as a kind of a birthplace for ideas for cinematic and novel horror. And it is called Wasteland, The Great War and the Origins of Modern Horror by W. Scott Poole, and he could be a fun guest.
Can any of our listeners tell we're recording this the week before Halloween?
Yes, for an episode that will go out at Christmas. Merry Christmas, everybody!
All right, guys. Well, we'll see what we turn it with next time out. Thanks very much.
And listeners can write in if they have a preference for any of these. Let us know.
Yeah. Or better still, if they've been mentioned, get in touch.
Come talk to us.
All right, guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
And apple jam. One for Richard, how can we spend the Olivia? Oh, it's a lovely war.